Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and over here I've got my VermiBag Mini. I was running European night crawlers in this system up until 47 days ago. And it was 47 days ago, almost 7 weeks ago, that I pulled all the contents of that system right there out. And I had placed it all into these two trays that you see stacked up onto one another. And I really didn't even treat these as regular composting systems within my wormery. And the telltale of that is the fact that there's no labels on either of these trays, as you can see. In my mind, these two trays are nothing more than an extension of the VermiBag Mini, only offering me a little bit more control over the contents of the containers. I wanted to allow the material in the bins to dry, and that was one of the main reasons, putting the material into smaller flat trays that would allow for a little bit of the drying to occur. And I also wanted to try to migrate them using a horizontal migration approach, and that's also something that's a lot easier to do in a tray, you know, as opposed to within a system like this. And I've had this set up this way, as I said, for 47 days now, and it was maybe a couple weeks ago that I began trying to move the worms out of the material. One of the trays is really fine filtered material, which I assumed was also full of worm cocoons, and the other stuff was the stuff that the filter captured, which was chunks of clumpy material as well as the worms themselves. And I've been trying to migrate worms out of the clumpy material that the adult worms were in. I believe that started maybe 27 days ago, almost 4 weeks ago. And it was 10 days ago that I had launched off a brand new bin over here, using the worms that I was able to extract out of that material in the tray that's got the adult worms in it. So far I've not moved anything out of the tray that's got the fine castings in it with the cocoons and the baby worms. Although I have been trying to lure the worms out of that material as well for, I don't know, maybe something in the neighborhood of about almost 3 weeks now, I believe 19 days. I was just looking at my spreadsheet, so I've got a lot of these numbers on the tip of my tongue because I was just trying to refresh my memory on where things stand. And I'd really like to see these systems come to a close, you know. Try to get the last of the worms out of those systems and free up the trays, get the castings into use somewhere in the garden. And then at that point, everything that used to be in the VermiBag Mini and held in these trays temporarily over the past few weeks will now all be in this new ENC bin down here. So we're going to check in now on these two temporary holding pens after 10 days since we last checked in on them, but also try to see if it's possible to consider one or maybe even both of them as a done deal at this point. So I'm going to put on a glove and we're going to get these flat trays up onto the bench and begin our assessment of where things stand. So let's get to work. So I've got the trays out here on the bench, but before I put on a glove and get to work on this, I wanted to address a question that came up recently. So since a picture tells 1,000 words, as they say, I created a little illustration. I actually drew up this illustration a number of days ago because I wanted to try to answer this question a while ago, but I got sidetracked. And basically, the question was, hey, all of your European night crawlers used to be in your VermiBag, and now I could see you've got European night crawlers in multiple locations. So how did all that come to be, and which one are we talking about right now? So here, I tried to depict the VermiBag. So the VermiBag Mini was where I had all of my European night crawlers for some time. And then at one point, not too long ago, I had decided it would be nice to have sort of a secondary system in which I've got European night crawlers. So I had used my, my shallow, clear, translucent tray to launch off that system. And that system ran really nicely for 161 days. And then when that system came to an end, I did a little something similar to what I've got going on down here, which is I took the material out of that system, putting in the really fine stuff that I was able to run through the sifter into a separate tray, assuming that that had a lot of cocoons in it, to treat that as sort of a cocoon nursery and give it some time for the worms to, be able to hatch out of those cocoons and make their way into sort of a collection area. And then the other bin was more or less just your everyday worm bin. If you've been following my European night crawlers in those other systems, then it is one of those trays that I'm currently having some difficulty with. In fact, I had a little bit of a die-off and a little bit of a firefight in one of those trays. Not the cocoon system, but the bin that was running the regular worms. Things got too damp. Things, I believe, went anaerobic. Worms started dying off, so I created a whole new batch of bedding and material for the worms to be in. Some of them moved over on their own. Some of them had to be relocated manually. Regrettably, a whole bunch of worms, I believe, were lost in that system. So I'm going to be trying to do my best to prevent that from happening elsewhere. But back to this system. This is the trays, as I mentioned, the trays that are not labeled as regular standalone systems. They're just a continuation of the VermiBag Mini. And the tray into which I moved some of the worms that got extracted out of here 10 days ago is the one that's down on the floor that we saw earlier. That's the one that's depicted here. So that's just a quick visual diagram showing my ENCs. Not even all completely depicted here, because I even have a few that are in a time-lapse container still running after many, many weeks. I've already released the time-lapse that those ENCs were represented in, but I kept that container going, and in fact I'm even doing a little continuation of that time-lapse right now. So that's a little sneak preview on what I might be releasing soon as far as another sort of continuation of that time-lapse. So I'm going to bring the camera in a little bit closer, but first I'm going to put on a glove. We're going to see how things are progressing in these trays here. All right, so now as we get our bins uncovered here to take a closer look, I just wanted to kind of retract something I said earlier. I believe I've, on second thought, decided I'm not going to do a haul out of worms today. This will really be nothing more than just a check-in at this point. And I guess the main reason is because in those other two systems that I've got, the European night crawlers, the ones that I've had the recent die-offs in, or at least the one that I had the recent die-offs in, since that we have a little intruder here, some centipede. Centipedes are not welcome guests in a worm bin. They do prey on worms when we don't want them around. So back to what I was saying. You know, since this has only been going this way for 47 days, I had a moment to reflect back onto the other systems, which have been going that way for 70 some odd days at this point. And I did notice when I last checked in on the cocoon nursery that is part of that other pair of bins, and it was at day 60 something when I last had a chance to check in on that cocoon nursery, and I was still observing baby worms within the filtered material. And since this tray of filtered material and cocoons has only had 47 days, I've got to assume that there's probably still a little bit of time remaining in which cocoons will continue hatching and baby worms will continue emerging. So in a way, I believe, just based on that observation in that other European nightcrawler cocoon nursery, I believe I do want to probably give a little bit more time to give the baby worms to emerge from their cocoons and make their way over into the baiting area. So we're going to scrap that whole idea of extraction and release of worms. So that 10-day-old bin is just going to sit down there on the floor where we saw it a moment ago, and we're not going to be bringing that up onto the bench today. I did check in on it 4 days ago, give it some food. It was actually the first application of food since the worms had been introduced to it 10 days ago. So so that bin's doing just fine, and at some point we will take all of the feeding area contents out of here and place them into that system at which point we're going to bring these two systems to a close, officially ending the VermiBag Mini's life cycle from start to finish. But I believe that it might just still be a little bit premature for that to occur. And, you know, I don't want to keep floundering and doubling back on what I said. But, you know, when I do look through this material, it is pretty much free of any baby worms. You know, if I just saw one or two baby worms, it would kind of give me further confirmation in my mind that additional time is required. Because I am giving that, I am making that conclusion based on what I'm seeing in the other European nightcrawler cocoon nursery. But, you know, I don't want to keep flip-flopping. I think I am going to stick to that basic concept that says, you know, maybe it does take a little bit of time for the last of the worms to make their way out of their cocoons and make their way over into the most favorable section of the container. So I think we will just continue to allow for the possible ongoing hatching of baby worms in here and the ongoing movement of those baby worms over into the baiting area. Although, I don't know, maybe it's just my poor vision. Maybe there are baby worms that I'm just missing. Maybe they're just not very active when you do unearth them, or they're very small. And I guess that's also part of the contributing reason I don't want to kind of hastily end the process just because I'm not seeing anything. It could just be any one of those explanations that I provided earlier for why I'm not seeing anything. So I think we'll just sort of take a leap of faith and let things continue here, at least for a little while longer. I don't even know if we're going to go into the 60 some odd days, 70 some odd days, as we're doing in the cocoon nursery and those other systems over there. But it does seem like after 6.5, almost 7 weeks, there might still be a little bit of an opportunity here to let baby worms still hatch, or even if they've all hatched, still let them become large enough and mobile enough to make their way over to where the feedings have been getting applied. We did, 10 days ago when we did do an extraction, place more food into both of these feeding areas and both of these trays. And people do keep mentioning how baby worms do have voracious appetites, so I shouldn't be too surprised if I check on the food supply that they were provided and find little or none. But when I look around, it just seems, as far as just the general number of worms in this feeding area, it doesn't seem like there's all that many. I mean, they're probably just mixed in with the material, and some of them might just be really puny. So if I just go a little bit slower, I could probably see them more easily. And it does look like we've actually got a pretty good number of them in here. And they're actually also leaving a good number of nice castings all over the place. So I'm going to kind of go on the assumption that if there are still food scrap, that there probably are still food scraps within this that they can continue to feed on, and that I don't really need to apply more food. And then, you know, if there's nothing else, ultimately they could probably also just start turning to this carbon-based food source, this paper, as ongoing source of nourishment. So I'm not going to worry about replenishing food supplies in here. I believe this is probably all they're going to get up until the point in time when I actually extract them out of here. So they'll be on a carbon-only diet until they get moved into their new home, where they'll start getting fresh kitchen scraps and stuff like that. So I just thought I saw a cocoon. But yeah, I don't know. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on what they think in terms of this particular system here. How much more time do you think we need? Am I making the right decisions on this? I hope everyone agrees that I am. Because look at this tray. This tray is going to be going in the trash. I believe I've just actually broken off what remains of the handle that I had actually tried repairing once before. So now I've got nothing to hold on to there. All right, onto the tray into which the adult worms were all placed, along with the material that they were inhabiting, which did not pass through the filter. Some of the stuff out here on the surface that was only covered with paper is definitely drying out pretty nicely. Pretty hard, dry stuff. Usually when I come in here, I try to see if I can break some of it apart into smaller little bits. I think the only way that that would actually be easy to break apart at some point would be to maybe combine it with some more damp stuff. Some of the stuff that's down low is a little bit more damp. You might be able to share some of its moisture with these hard, crumbly chunks and enable them to break apart. But we did definitely notice that there were very few worms remaining in here, even last time we were in here 10 days ago. The feeding area that we've been setting up for them has been getting replenishments of food. Here I'm wondering if 10 days later, since I am going to hold off on doing one haul out of both systems, I don't want the ongoing delay in relocating worms out of here to result in this side of the bin being out of food, although there is a good amount of carbon-based food in here too. So maybe I could just sort of take that same point of view on here to say that here's like a leftover banana peel stem, a whole bunch of paper and cardboard that they can continue feeding on. Not to mention the fact that 10 days ago when we pulled worms out of here, we could have potentially removed the vast majority of the worms. So the number of worms gathering over here are probably very few at this point. Whatever few were still lingering out here within the material, gradually realizing that the material just continues to dry and becomes less hospitable for them to stay in, do eventually end up over here underneath that little piece of plastic that's attempting to hold in the moisture that's in here. Hopefully not causing a lack of airflow and hopefully not causing an anaerobic environment. But I would think that since it is just a little small strip of plastic with the edge of it pretty well exposed, it is also at the same time letting in a good amount of air as well. And the stuff is kind of large and, not all laying up against each other. I would assume that there's also a good amount of air flowing between all these chunks of material in here too. So here too, another chunk of banana stem. All bits of food that these worms can continue to feast on up until the point in time in the near future when we end up pulling everybody out of both trays and calling an end to this kind of extension to the VermiBag Mini. My only thought was to maybe spray down the feeding area with a little bit of moisture, just to throw a little bit of additional dampness in there, since I'm sure it's losing moisture. The plastic covering is probably not entirely locking in all the moisture that's over there. So maybe I will just spray it down before we cover up, just to give it a little bit more moisture. But I am getting this sense that it might just be time to call it quits on both of these at some point soon. And you know what? As long as I got my squirt bottle, why not just apply a little bit more moisture over into there too, right? I do believe that the material in both of these kind of baiting areas or bedding areas or collection areas, whatever you want to call them, is porous enough, has enough cavities in between the chunks of material to permit some airflow, so that there's probably no danger of either of these turning into sort of an anaerobic dangerous environment that the worms could potentially be at risk in. So Hopefully everyone agrees that that is indeed the case in both of these systems, and that continuing with plastic coverings here is not going to cause these worms any harm. Plastic in this particular case is serving a very important function and does warrant continued use, at least in this particular application. Even though we've been growing suspicious that plastic coverings could be causing some of my grief in some of my systems, here I believe it does kind of make sense to continue as is for a little while longer. But how much longer? That's really the question. I'd love to hear people's ideas about how much longer you think I've got to let this go. Or do I just cut my losses if there are still cocoons, if there are still babies hanging out in this material, which we didn't even see any of? Then, you know, is it a reasonable thing just to let those babies just go with the castings out into the garden and live out their lives out in nature, which would be fine too as far as I'm concerned. I can go either way. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to my channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.